Welcome to Watchtower History. Now we're going to take a more refined focus on some of these Watchtower conspiracy theories that they were looking at. Knowing what we know now about the theories that were going around at the time, and highly influenced by Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent and that International Jew, it wasn't the only source because a lot of that was out there already. But now let's look at what some of the things that we've already seen. And when you look at them again, you see it with a different light. So in Favored People, these have seen the selfish and commercial spirit of the men called Jews. Here's the Jewish bankers again. The Jews are a commercial people. Some of them are the richest and most avarice men the world has ever known. The chief men of big business. Now when you hear the phrases that Rutherford's saying, and knowing the background of it, what was the zeitgeist of the time, now you start to see things that you hadn't seen before. You start to recognize things previously unseen. And once you see it, it's very hard to unsee it. It's very hard not to see it.
But the irony of all this is while the Jehovah's Witnesses today preach about their brotherhood, their love, the Christianity and all that, the people who weren't involved in the anti-Semitism were looking at Rutherford and Watch Tower as something to avoid because of their personal ideologies. So that's the irony of the whole thing. The Watchtower really in that time started out, people are like, oh my God, these guys, take them off the radio. These guys are Jew haters. You know, they're racist. You know, they just really took and hence the religion came sprung right out from it.
And now when you look back at and you realize in the 1920s, late 1920s, Watchtower has already been putting some of this stuff out there. They lost 80% of the people.
We're being conservative.
They were either disfellowshipped or left because of ideas like this that were going out there. Not just ideas that, hey, we're the chosen one, we're the only ones. This is real hate speech. This is real hate speech.
So all the new people attracted to this were from a whole different mindset. They attracted a whole new crowd to a whole brand new religion.
They attracted,
the people following Russell were the same type of people who wanted to follow this path.
They were attracting people who were attracted to hate speech. In Rutherford's book, His Vengeance, you can see on the back cover, you have here the Jewish banker, but notice he's holding bags of money. The British pound and the American dollar. Here you have the international Jew in a visual form. This is a dog whistle to say, hey, we've got similar ideas. No wonder they're telling Henry Ford to say, hey, Henry ought to get Judge Rutherford's book, Vindication, because they have very, very similar ideas. So in the crisis booklet, there's a picture inside, and if you look, you see the Jewish man sitting at the table, and he's holding a bag of money. All right, so this book is quite interesting. So the Universal War book is also interesting because, again, you see the Jewish banker, and on his bag here, he has all sorts of international currency. The franc, the pound, the dollar, the Deutschmark, and he's also holding the symbol of the medicine. One of Ford's conspiracies was about the Jews were plotting to control the world through vaccines. If you remember the early Watchtower history, they were quite opposed to vaccines. Watchtower was taking these ideas that were very common at the time and putting their own little spin on it. in the Righteous Ruler book, there's another one. You can see the Catholic next to the Jew, and notice the Jew's holding the money bags. So if there's any doubt who or what he's talking about, he's describing the Jews here as the enemies. And on the cover is how he depicts his enemies and what's going on. And those are Ezekiel's wheels within the wheels. And that's pointing to the Vindication book, where he's strongly anti-Semitic, and is that Vindication book again, which they were suggesting to Henry Ford that Henry ought to read Rutherford's book, Vindication, because he would find things he would like. And so the Righteous Ruler booklet says, I warn the people of a wicked conspiracy formed by Satan, and in which conspiracy there are joined the international bankers. There's the international Jews again. The unfaithful clergy and the conscienceless politicians, among the purposes of which conspiracy are these: to put America in the League of Nations. There's the beast. Now the United Nations, of course. Control the money and all other property. Rule the people by the hand of their one-man dictator. Destroy the freedom of speech and press, and stop the true worship of God in Christ. But be of good courage. The hand of Almighty God at Armageddon will smite all these enemies to the dust. So again, you got that strike contrast between Rutherford's view of Armageddon and what Russell's view was. Rutherford's view was much more judgmental. All our enemies are going to be destroyed. And so in Rutherford's Supremacy book, you can see the Jehovah's Witnesses here on the right-hand side. And in the spread, if you turn around and look on the back, look at this zoomed up, and I blew it up here in the slide. You could see the Jewish bankers with their money. You can see the dollar symbols. But you also see them holding up a flag. And it's a British Israelite flag, an Anglo-American. So here he's linking in the Jewish bankers, the Jewish conspiracies, with his idea of the Anglo-American powers. And if you look on one of those flags there, it looks like one of them could be a hammer and a sickle. Well, if you look at the Nazi artwork, they're doing the same thing. You can see this Der Jude here, where you've got the British and the American flag, again, the Anglo-American powers, with the communist flag as well, linking that all together in one image. Here you've got it in Watchtower literature, right out in the open. If there's any question on that, there's a lot of artwork that's like that in the Nazi literature. Yeah, and you can see the Jewish bankers going through. It's like a Red Sea of blood, and they've got all the bags of currency there, all the bags of money. On the Supremacy booklet, you can see the Jewish banker, and he's got this yoke on with the political, religious, and economic powers. And notice he's got the little dollar sign there as well. You've got the Jewish banker again, and it says Armageddon. And it says, be not afraid, the battle is God's. Here in the one on the left, but they shall not prevail against thee. You can see the Jewish banker there in the back, and you can see the Nazi flag, the Nazi swastika, and the communist flag as well, along with the Catholic Church there. That's the papal flag there as well. Again, linking them in with this conspiracy and the Anglo-American powers. This is where Rutherford's getting his Anglo-American powers concept from, really.
And he created it into a new beast, a new entity to fight.
Yeah. You'll see the same thing on the Theocracy booklet. And that's basically the same as the last one that we just saw. But you could see the American flag there, kind of like a walking corpse. And look who he's guiding. You've got Stalin there. I think that's Hitler. And you got the swastika, and you got the bankers there. So very, very similar. A lot of these are calendars that they were putting out in the day. That was the image of the calendar, and then they would have the calendar underneath it. If you look in the lower right corner there, you can see the Jewish banker yet again.
Could you imagine hanging that in your house for a year? look at. I mean, especially this one. You're talking. You've got a Mayan god sitting on the throne there.
Here's another one. Rutherford's Escape to the Kingdom booklet. And you can see, there's some Jewish-looking individuals down there in the lower corner, and they're trying to gather up their bars of gold and their money as well. But this one also has the Catholic there in the background with his cross and his clerical collar, which Rutherford was also bringing into this conspiracy that he was trying to build, that the entire world was against them. The Jews, the Catholics, the Christians, the banker, everybody. And if there's any question about it, of course, the text in the booklet makes it very, very clear. In the booklet, Rutherford says, "It may be said that the Catholic organization, headed by its mighty pontiff, the multitudinous divisions of the Protestant organizations, headed by their wise and eloquent clergy, and the Jews, led by their philosophical rabbis, this united religious multitude, supported by the professional politicians and financial giants," here's the international Jew again, "will present such an inspiring spectacle before the throne of God that even he will hear and grant their petitions, that they may be relieved of their burdens and given more ease and comfort. The question is, will Jehovah God hear and grant the prayers of such an unholy alliance? According to the words of the scriptures, God answers no. The scriptures declare that all men are by nature unrighteous, and that righteousness can be obtained only by faith in and obedience to Jehovah, and faith in Christ Jesus and his shed blood as the redemptive price of man. Prayer to Jehovah must be asked in the name of Christ Jesus, because God has thus commanded it. All Jewish rabbis entirely reject Jesus Christ as the Redeemer of man." And so again, he's getting rid of the Jews. All modernist clergymen do likewise reject him and his precious blood. So again, they disagree with us. They don't make it either. And the entire combination heretofore mentioned rejects Jehovah God's provision through Christ and his kingdom to bless all the families of the earth with peace and prosperity. Well, if they agreed with you, they would make it, and if they didn't agree, they wouldn't. This is where he's going. And on the contrary, have given their allegiance to the League of Nations. Here's his beast again, which is a product of the devil. The entire combination forms the visible ruling powers of this world, and concerning such, it is written that the whole world lies in the wicked one, Satan. This is what Rutherford was railing against. Everyone who disagreed with him, and he's blaming all the world's problems on. Again, this is what Rutherford's building his theology out of, his doctrine, these new teachings here in the late 1920s and the 1930s. In Ford's Dearborn Independent, they were blaming the Jews for the American agriculture failures. And in the Crisis booklet by Rutherford, you can see a statement here where he's talking about this big business, again, the Jew, and they're these greedy ones, with grasping arms like tentacles of a mighty octopus. Now, the giant octopus with the tentacles wrapped around the world is another one of those old anti-Semitic tropes that Rutherford is using. With grasping arms like tentacles of a mighty octopus, it has laid hold upon practically all the visible wealth of the nation. At the same time, the men who by laborious efforts have developed the country and produced the wealth of the land have been unjustly treated and robbed, and today they are crying for bread, and that in a land of boundless plenty. Many Americans in sorrowful tones are now asking the question, can the nation of America long endure while such unjust conditions exist? Remember, this is during the Great Depression when people are starving to death. Big business has no regard for the rights of the common people. The Civil War of 1863 was fomented and carried forward for the purpose of creating a condition by which big business could obtain a stranglehold on the nation. This is Rutherford's book. We got the same idea in the Dearborn Independent, conspiracy of long standing. There cannot be any question, in fact, I know, Bismarck speaking, that many years before the actual outbreak of the Civil War in North America, it has been secretly decreed by the inner financial circle of Europe to split the United States apart into two co-equal federations. So again, they're bringing these ideas into Watchtower. They're making this a part of the foundation of their theology.
And that's the exact way to put it. They're bringing these ideas for the foundation of their theology. And whose theology of it? Who created it? Rutherford.
Rutherford, but who is he saying that the Nazis' theology came from? He says that's from Satan, which are saying the same thing. So the audience can make their decision. Rutherford says, big business has in its employ the most astute lawyers of the nations who write the contracts always in the interest of their clients, and the common people must take the ragged end. And while he's drawing a Jewish banker at the table in the booklet, right? And remember, Rutherford was a lawyer, so who would really know that? And we've seen some of his shady dealings from the newspaper and the other records. But anyway, the Dearborn Independent, for its paper, says, that is the element which strikes something like consternation in the heart of the ordinary lover of law and order. The insolence which these wealthy Jewish criminals regard all the agencies of the law. They are defended by clever lawyers, and the attitude of the Jewish press and Jewish population toward them is a compact of sympathy and admiration. Rutherford says, in 1917, big business, for ultra-selfish reasons, needlessly and wantonly forced the American nation into the World War, which resulted in the greatly increased wealth and power of a few men and made serfs and paupers of many millions of people. So basically, he's blaming the Jews for the World War. Henry Ford, in his International Jew, and even in articles that were written during the World War, there's one there that says, commercialism made this war. Another one says, commercialism aided by politicians responsible for Europe's Great War, declares Henry Ford. Those were written during the war.
Now,
what term is Rutherford using for these Jews? Commercial Jews.
Okay, now let me comment here so that there's people who kind of understand and think from a different aspect here. Okay, we're not saying that commercialism, greed, the big business entities themselves, the church aren't working, doing stuff together, creating problems, and we're not saying that. What we are kind of showing is their perception of how those entities are creating all the trouble. And it being pointing to a meeting of Jews getting together to take over the world. That's how Ford is presenting it. That's how Rutherford's presenting it. So it's the idea of who's behind it, not the fact that it's happening. That's the whole key. And because Ford took other ideas and blamed it on the Jews, you're literally talking a whole ethnic group, 6 million people, literally wiped out because ideas blaming Jews for doing this kind of stuff.
And that's what we're...
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. And you look like Bonet and Nunthort, however you pronounce his name. You look at them. Oh, I was at a restaurant, had a letter, met with them. Okay, well, prove it. Are these people going to talk to you? It infiltrated in such a way that it caused problems. And if you look, we're only on the artwork. You saw us talking about the statements. You see the influence that it had on people. So yes, these big businesses are there. These giant corporations, they are trying to not pay a fair wage and keep as much profit for themselves. There is all that going on, but is it controlled by a secret society?
The secret Jews, yeah. And so that's the point that we're looking at. Just these ideas. and how watchtowers borrowing ideas from these other sources. Very, very similar ideas. And so in the Dearborn Independence book, The International Jew, Ford's book, there's a chapter. Did the Jews foresee the World War? And of course that would have caught Watchtower's attention, right? And it says, we know this. The Jews in their Congress at Basel in 1903 foresaw the future World War. How do they know it would be a world war? We know this also. The protocols, perhaps as early as 1896, certainly not later than 1905, foresaw the policy of no annexations. The World War came to pass. No annexations came to pass. What was then future in the Jewish world program is now past. And so again, Rutherford is blaming the Jews, these big business Jews, for the cause of the World War. And asking this question, did the Jews foresee the World War, that would have really caught Watchtower's attention. And so I think that's one of the things that, that really made them keep following Ford's ideas to see what he was going to say next.
They were reading his work and actually commenting it in their magazine. So they were aware of what he was printing and actually following it.
So in the July 20th, 1932 Golden Age, they publish Rutherford's radio lecture, Can the American Government Endure? And of course, this was also put in the newspapers. Can the American government endure? No, says Rutherford. Knowing now what we know, some of these quotes that Rutherford's stating is interesting. Big business has no regard for the rights of the common people. It controls the two major political parties of America and names and elects at will the public men to office who best serve their selfish interests. Big business controls the army and the navy, the guns, the ammunition, and the police power of the nation. Satan has used commerce, politics, and religion that he might get complete control of the human race and defame the name of and word of Jehovah God. The greatest crisis of the ages is now upon the world, and this includes the American government. In 1917, big business, for ultra-selfish reasons, needlessly and wantonly forced the American nation into the World War, which resulted in the greatly increased wealth and power of a few men. The same selfish interests own and control the professional clergymen, and these men make merchandise of the Word of God in order to keep the people in ignorance and subjection to the ruling powers. Thus, it is plainly seen that the power of government is centralized into the hands of a very few. The American government has been weighed in the balance and found wanting. It cannot endure. Together with all other nations, it soon shall fall. Such fall will be in spite of everything big business, politicians, and the clergymen, and the military, and the strong Mars squad, and the devil, and all of his hosts can do to hold together the oppressive rule. It must and will fall because Jehovah's God's kingdom is here. Hasten to take shelter under Jehovah's kingdom. So you can see here what Rutherford's doing. He's taking that fear rhetoric that's in the zeitgeist of the time, the fear rhetoric that everyone knew from Ford's International Jew, the fear rhetoric of what's going on in the Nazis, and he's using it to try and frighten people into accepting his message.
Well, he had a mansion to pay for.
All right.
And gas wasn't cheap in a big 12-cylinder Cadillac.
Knowing now what we know, let's go back and look at some of the things that we looked at before. Let's look at our third trumpet blast. This is a 1923 LA convention. If we knew then what we know now, we might have looked at it a little bit differently. Or the advertisement for this lecture at the convention says, the clergy have abandoned the word of God and joined hands with big business and big politicians in an attempt to control the world. And these are opposed by radical forces.
This is a third trumpet.
Right? Yeah. So now when we go back and look at what we already discussed, you can start seeing this was very early on. in Rutherford's thinking. In this lecture, Rutherford's basically claiming that the Jews were plotting to become dictators over America. Rutherford says big business maintains paid lobbyists at Washington. Well, the International Jew from Ford's Dearborn Independent says in Russia, he, the Jew, is charged with being the source of Bolshevism. In Germany, he's charged with being the cause of the empire's collapse. In England, he's charged with being the real world ruler who rules as a supernation over the nations, rules by the power of gold, and who plays nation against nation for his own purposes, remaining himself discreetly in the background. In America, it's pointed out to what extent the elder Jews of wealth and younger Jews of ambition swarmed through the war organizations, commercial and industrial business of war.
And again, we're not saying there are not lobbyists and special interests behind politicians. What we're showing is their idea is that there's a Zionist movement over them with like puppets controlling them to say that.
And
they're controlling themselves, and it's driven by greed.
And this was the ideology that brought about the Nazis.
Yes.
And the Nazi extermination. And so we're seeing that same ideology in the Watchtower literature, that same hate speech, that same hate rhetoric.
Now, I'll use an example of that. Okay. If you look at the Gestapo and how they handled their policing, what's it like when one of the Jehovah's Witnesses does something? Okay, they're told on. They're out there to catch you, to tell on you, to get you in trouble. It's like a Gestapo police force going on. So here you go, the mindset coming in from all this ideology kicking in. The disfellowshipping, shunning, it's all hard-handed tactics stemming from the mindset of how the religion was created.
And they're using fear to try and get converts. Using fear of this conspiracy, fear of the Jews who are controlling everything. The same fear that the Nazis used to get followers. The same ideology that the Nazis used to kill millions. So now when we go back and we look at Rutherford's Declaration of Facts that was sent to Hitler, let's look at it with this idea in mind, with this in view, and see, let us fact check. Let's find the sources of some of these things that are mentioned in the Declaration of Facts and see if it coincides with the evidence that we've already presented. All right, so in the Declaration of Facts, there's a statement that says this, and he's talking about the Jews. And he says, this fact particularly applies to the cities of London and New York, the stronghold of big business. This fact is so manifest in America that there is a proverb concerning the city of New York which says, the Jews own it. The Irish Catholics rule it, and the Americans pay the bills. When you look in the newspaper record, you can find that's different similar things that are going around. So one here says that the Jews own it, the Irish run it, the French style it, the Greeks feed and shine it, the Chinese wash it, the Germans cuss it, and so on and so forth. They're just racist things that were published in many of the newspapers around the country at the time. In Rutherford's Supremacy book, he says, some men advocate various schemes of relief, such as communism, revolution, and other deeds of violence. So they're looking at this Ezekiel book. And remember, he's saying those are not the Jews. So everything bad about the Jews is about them. Everything good about the Jews is about us. That replacement theology. Very, very anti-Semitic things that are in Vindication Volume 2. And in regards to this context that he's talking about the Jews, he says, some men advocate various schemes of relief, such as communism, revolution, and other deeds of violence. Right? What is Ford's book saying? That the Jew are the ones responsible for this. Again, quite similar, very, very similar. So if there's any question at all that Rutherford's talking about the Jews in those Ezekiel contexts, I think he says very, very clearly. I don't think there's any question, but here's one where he says, already Satan and his wicked forces under Gog, both invisible and visible, have formed a conspiracy and have begun the committing of overt acts against these faithful witnesses of Jehovah. The day rapidly approaches for the great conflict, and Jehovah God says to the enemy forces, as stated in the prophecy of Ezekiel, I am against you and all your organization, and I will destroy you. Jehovah's name shall be vindicated, and all creation shall know that he is the God. Hence Satan and his entire organization must fall, and that includes the American government. And this is the context of the Ezekiel 38 and 39, where he's doing the replacement theology. Here's a statement here in that same context of the Vindication book. The most powerful part of the earth's satanic organization is big business. The prophecy therefore seems to relate to the satanic organization of the earth, the chief part, which is big business, and also the other parts of that organization under the supervision of Gog, the prince of the devil's organization. And who does he link into it? He says, this mixed multitude that God brings against Jehovah's organization, so far as the earthly division thereof is concerned, reminds one of the heterogeneous crowd that now composes the League of Nations, with the British Empire in the literal north being the chiefest part thereof, and the leading the League of Nations. This organization of the League of Nations is subterfuge and a substitute for Christ's kingdom. All right, remember, we've already seen Rutherford's linking the Jews, the League of Nations, the Anglo-American powers. He's linking them all into this composite beast that he's creating. Well, Ford is also linking the League of Nations to the Jews as well. So again, we have a very, very similar thing. You're laughing.
I'm laughing. I mean, he's creating a cartoon character as part of his religion. You know, he really is. I mean, like, there's this beast out here doing this. I mean, it's holy cow.
All right, so about the League of Nations, the December 19th, 1925 Dearborn Independent. Should America join the World Court? And of course, the Dearborn Independent, Ford's newspaper, saying no, because it's controlled by Jews. They're suggesting the British Empire was controlled by the Jews. And again, so was Rutherford and his righteous ruler. The May 23rd, 1925 Dearborn Independent, again, asks this question, where are Israel's lost tribes? And again, here's another kind of replacement theology that they're doing and saying, well, the British and American empires are really the lost tribes of Israel. And we're the ones that are the real Jews and the other ones aren't, right? And so what's Rutherford doing? He's also doing a sort of replacement theology. But remember, the writer of Ford's Independent, when the Independent was shut down, he left and started a white supremacist movement, a neo-Nazi group here in the United States, who was very, very involved in that Anglo-American British Israelite replacement theology thinking. So that was a whole catalyst for that white supremacist movement in the 1930s. And we'll get into that in a little bit more.
Yeah, the Israel's lost tribe thought, I'll call it that. That's a whole subject unto itself. You could spend hours just talking about that.
And we have.
Well, we haven't reached out where it came from, bringing it to Rutherford.
This Golden Age article, this lecture of Rutherford. Rutherford goes on to explain how the unbelieving Jews who are attacked in this Ezekiel context are similar to the unbelieving Christians who will be attacked and destroyed for attacking Jehovah's Witnesses. And this is the same thing found in the Vindication book. He says, there was a partial fulfillment of this prophecy upon Palestine in the days of Ezekiel and Nehemiah. The complete fulfillment could not apply to the literal land of Palestine. The Jews were evicted from Palestine, and their house left under them desolate because they rejected Christ Jesus, the beloved and anointed King of Jehovah. To this day, the Jews have not repented of this wrongful act committed by their forefathers. Many of them have been returned to the land of Palestine, but they have been induced to go there because of selfishness and for sentimental reasons. And so, a little further down, he says, in contrast to this, during the World War, the Jews received recognition of the heathen nations. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration, sponsored by the heathen governments of Satan's organization, came forth, recognized the Jews, and bestowed upon them great favors. In this, the seventh world power took the lead. So he's tying in the seventh world power taking the lead with the Jews and his conspiracies about the Jews. This is where the Anglo-American powers, this is where the League of Nations, this is where the United Nations, this is where that updated King of the North and King of the South came from. This is where that beast starts to really take shape, to take form in Rutherford's thinking and Rutherford's doctrine. He continues. Now big business, the Jews, and other wings of Satan's organization place the Jews alongside of and in the same category as the Gentiles. So they're not equal. In the middle paragraph here, Rutherford continues, Jehovah declares his purpose to cause the heathen nations to bear their shame. By, quote, heathen, unquote, nations, here are meant to those who are against his kingdom. We'll skip down a little bit. Even in this day, God has brought a measure of shame upon, quote, Christendom, unquote, by the wide circulation of the message of truth printed and put into the hands of the people, including the statements in the 7 vials of wrath. Remember, they were looking at this as the finished mystery before. Now they're looking at it as his 7 trumpet messages, which all, of course, revolved around messages that Rutherford was putting out in the 1920s. And of course, since Rutherford was the one taking the lead of the organization in the 1920s, it's not only that Jehovah's Witnesses were the chosen organization, since he was taking the lead, he was the chosen one leading the chosen organization. But he ends this statement by saying, the greatest shame upon these, however, will come at Armageddon when God's great sword desolates the nations. And this next subheading in the Vindication book is for his name's sake. And remember, we've discussed this whole idea of the vindication of Jehovah's name. If you haven't seen that discussion, please go and take a look. But this whole idea about Jehovah's name or the vindicating of Jehovah's name was something new that Rutherford was bringing in starting in about 1925. And here he elaborates and talks about how this is vindicated through the destruction of those he deems are part of Satan's organization. And the Jews he's making a part of Satan's organization. The statement here reads, because of the wickedness of the Jews in Palestine, God poured out his fury upon them. Because of the wickedness of Christendom, God has poured out his fury upon that part of Satan's organization. Their greater scattering and execution of the judgment upon them are in the near future. So he's predicting not only will, quote, Christendom be destroyed, but also the Jews. Rutherford's lecture here continues. He says, a conspiracy is a wicked device formed to do injury to others. This prophecy indicates that the conspiracy is formed against God's anointed people for the purpose of destroying them. And I'll skip down a little bit. We may be sure that big business is fully aware of the assault that is to be made against God's organization. And skip down a bit more. The commercial barons, here's our international Jew again. However, by conniving and conspiring to injure and destroy God's remnant, will bring them no advantage. All right, so here again, we're back to this statement in the Golden Age. Henry ought to get Judge Rutherford's work Vindication.
Why?
And we asked the question, why? Earlier, why? And so let's look at some of the other influence directly tying into Rutherford as well. So in the Democratic Banner, August 24th, 1915, there was an article with the headline, Henry Ford against war will fight militarism. Well, Rutherford has a lecture shortly after that, December 31st, 1915, How Will Militarism Be Forever Destroyed? And he's using some very, very similar ideas. Both articles here are blaming big business as the cause of the Great War, the World War I. And both of their titles are similar with the title Militarism. This article, Militarism, also was a booklet, a pamphlet that was published as well by Rutherford.
You got to kind of look at the Ford Rutherford as, and maybe I'll use a parody about it, the Beatles and the Monkees. The Beatles became this phenomenal success. So here comes other little entities, record labels. Well, wait, we got to have our Beatles. So they make the Monkees. And they're basically copying everything that the Beatles are doing, make them funny, make them cute, put their hair, the British accent, they just want to repeat. And it's like it's like Rutherford is following Ford in a lot of ways through this. And as we were looking at this, we found a lot of, right after he said this, Rutherford came out with that. There's just too many patterns in this. And it's like he's trying to create what's going on, the influence that Henry Ford has. Hey, how can I capitalize on this for my religion?
All right. And so this, very, very good. And we're going to see one of the reasons why Rutherford is following Ford here in just a moment. This article has a statement. All can readily see how this prophecy has been fulfilled and is now in process of fulfillment. All the nations that claim to be Christian nations have been fulfilling this prophecy for several years, and this and other scriptures clearly prove that before the trouble had ended, all of the so-called Christian nations of the earth will be involved. For this reason, we state that there is no earthly power that can now prevent the United States from being involved in the great and final conflict. Mr. Bryan and others, seeing that preparedness for war means war, are diligently working to prevent preparedness. Their efforts are honest and praiseworthy, but they cannot succeed. The doom of Babylon is sealed. The United States composes a part of Babylon. That was not a typical thought at the time, that the United States was a part of Babylon. So that kind of blows me away. But notice he's talking about Bryan here.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember, we talked about Rutherford's political career earlier, he had been campaigning for Bryan for years. Bryan's talking against the World War here. Bryan's suggesting they should remain neutral. Bryan's suggesting they should stay out of the war. Does any of this sound familiar?
Yes. And another take on it too is you could see here Rutherford's not separating himself from a man-made solution. It's like deep down he feels Bryan's solution would work if he could win. But I know because God's going to take over that it's not going to happen. He's still leaning toward those political ideologies. Why would you quote Bryan on that? He's still dressing like him. So I find that interesting personally.
All right. So what's even more interesting is during the First World War, we mentioned this earlier, Henry Ford commissioned a peace ship.
Henry Ford had experienced a healthy dose of success with the Model T and again with the $5 day. On the strength of this public approval, Ford began to feel that he should speak out on other issues. And with Europe exploding into war, he tried international politics. A young reporter sent out to interview Ford came back with a story quoting the carmaker as saying that he would give everything he possessed to stop the war. As the story spread, a noted peace activist approached Henry Ford. She found him a willing listener. Ford agreed to attend a meeting that very weekend in New York. There, his name was added to a delegation that would petition the warring governments.
They weren't the sort of people that he would normally have got involved in, but they did flatter him. It was a simple sort of solution. Charter a ship, go to Europe, stop the war. Henry Ford can produce a Model T. Why can't he stop a world war? It was an illustration both of his idealism and now of his arrogance.
The peace delegation was far from united around the cause. As members fell to arguing and backbiting, the shipboard press delighted in sending scathing stories home. By the time the ship docked in Norway, Ford was deeply discouraged. He left for the States just a few days after landing.
During the First World War, we mentioned this earlier, Henry Ford commissioned a peace ship. He took that peace ship to Europe, and he thought that he could try and talk them out of the World War. And then he blamed the Jews for it, right? But his friend William Jennings Bryan visited him on the peace ship before it left for Europe, but he chose not to go with Ford and the rest. And you can see a photo there of Henry Ford and William Jennings Bryan together. Is it any wonder that Rutherford is quite interested not only in William Jennings Bryan's ideas, because Rutherford campaigned for William Jennings Bryan in his earlier career for years, but also of the ideas of Henry Ford.
I'm going to take it again, a psychological step on here. Going back to Vindication, Ford should read Rutherford's book, Vindication. Okay, here now Rutherford's making comment with Bryan and all that. There's almost like, to me anyway, a little jealousy, like Rutherford should be on that ship with Ford. He should be there too. It's like he's envious of what he's seeing on that, in what they're like, they are more powerful and political than him. He's building a religious empire almost to try and compete with a political and a financial system. So here you have, literally here you have in this picture, you have the finance, the big money, you have the politician, and you have the religion, all in.
Oh wow! All
in one
interesting.
Big incorporated ideal, and it's looking like he wants to be part of that.
The Chicago Daily Tribune, for June 23rd, 1916, had an editorial. Ford is an anarchist. And remember, the world is in the midst of the First World War, the Great War at the time. And basically what's going on is what's outlined in the first paragraph of the editorial. And it says, inquiry at the Henry Ford offices in Detroit discloses the fact that employees of Ford who are members of or recruits in the National Guard will lose their places. No provision will be made for anyone dependent upon them. Their wages will stop. Their families may get along in any fashion possible. Their positions will be filled. And if they come back safely and apply for their jobs again, they will be on the same footing as any other applicants. This is the rule for Ford employees everywhere. And I'll skip down to the third paragraph. Mr. Ford thus proves that he does not believe in service to the nation in the fashion a soldier must serve it. And then a couple more paragraphs down, it says, a man so ignorant as Henry Ford may not understand the fundamentals of the government under which he lives. The government is permitted to take Henry Ford himself and command his services as a soldier, if necessary. It can tax his money for war purposes and will. It can compel him to devote himself to national purposes. The reason it did not take the person of Henry Ford years ago and put it in uniform is, first, that it had not been the common sense to make its theoretical universal services practical, and second, because there have been young men to volunteer for the services which has protected Henry Ford and for which services he now penalizes them. And so remember, Ford was a pacifist. He chartered the peace ship and went to Europe to try and stop the World War. Ford wasn't very happy with this article, and so he filed a libel suit against the Tribune, which came to court, and it came to trial in 1919. In the trial, Ford is put on the stand, and there's an interesting back and forth here between Ford and the opposite lawyer. What happened in 1776? Henry Ford didn't know, but there was a revolution in 1812. The following shaft of light on the American history was cast by Henry Ford in the course of the trial of his libel suit against the Chicago Tribune, Mr. Ford being cross-examined by Mr. Stevenson, counsel for the defendant. Question: do you know anything about the revolution, Mr. Ford? Yes, sir. Do you have in mind, or do you understand that the flintlock muskets were used in a revolution? Answer: they are all out of date, I know. Question: what revolution did you have in mind, Mr. Ford? Ford answered, in 1812. You don't know of any other? No, Ford answered. Don't you know that there was not any revolution in 1812? Ford replied, I didn't know that. I did not pay much attention to it. Question: don't you know that this country was born out of a revolution in 1776? Did you forget that? And Ford responded, I guess I did. Now remember, what Henry Ford is being questioned here in this article, in this editorial, is exactly what Rutherford was getting in trouble for also in the First World War, when Watchtower was even going as far as telling those who are already in the armed forces to act in insubordination. This is the main reason that Watchtower bunch was found criminally negligent under the Act of Sedition. If you haven't seen our Faith in Action review, where we go into a great amount of detail and depth on this, go check that out. There's a lot of interesting things found in the Rutherford versus United States court transcript. And so the Chicago Tribune is already calling Ford an anarchist and dangerous in 1916 and even in 1919. Little did they know what Ford's influence would be on not only American culture, but worldwide culture, and especially the Nazi Party in Germany and Adolf Hitler, who mentioned him in Mein Kampf.
In early summer 1919, Henry Ford arrived at the courthouse in Mount Clemens, Michigan, a small town north of Detroit. Ford had sued the Chicago Tribune for libel after the paper called him an ignorant idealist and an anarchist enemy of the nation. Now, he would take the stand. To disprove the allegation of libel, the Tribune set out to prove Ford's ignorance. Do you know anything about the revolution, Mr. Ford? The Tribune's lawyer asked. Yes, sir, Ford replied. What revolution did you have in mind, Mr. Ford? In 1812, Ford answered, to the amazement of the people in the courtroom.
They basically asked him, you might say, high school questions. And he was revealed to be pathetically inarticulate and ill-informed. The stuff he didn't know was amazing to people.
Don't you know there was not any revolution in 1812? The lawyer persisted. Don't you know that this country was born out of a revolution in 1776? Did you forget that? I guess I did, Ford answered.
The defense attorneys want to paint him as someone who is semi-literate. They ask him to read passages, and he refuses. First day he says that he forgot his glasses. The next day he said that, he can't read because his eyes are watery. And he comes across as being out of his depth.
Newspapers from across the country covered the trial in breathless detail, as Ford was subjected to 8 days of questioning.
He hates lawyers, just as he hates Wall Street. And he can't get off the stand. He can't just get up and say, I don't have to take this, I'm Henry Ford. No, sir, you are under oath.
When the trial finally concluded, the jury, made up mostly of farmers, found that Ford had indeed been libeled. He may have been ignorant, but he was no anarchist. But despite the victory, Ford was deeply wounded by the experience. The press, in particular, heaped ridicule on the automaker for his embarrassing performance.
For everyone who was there, particularly newspaper reporters, what this seemed to clinch was their suspicion that Henry Ford was a rural rube who had stumbled into his success. A stupid man representing stupid ideas and stupid people.
Mr. Ford, wrote the New York Times, has been submitted to a severe examination of his intellectual qualities. He has not received a pass. The New York Post put it even more harshly. The man is a joke.
Remember, one of the reasons Rutherford is suggesting that his replacement theology is the way to go, that we're the spiritual Jews, all of the Bible is literally about us after 1914 or 1918, now 1919, is based out of his book Vindication again. And what does he say about the Jews in Vindication? He says, the Jews that are now gathered to Palestine are not there to glory God, because they are gathered in unbelief and they do not serve God. Right? And then he says that the reference to the last quoted scripture is that God's anointed remnant instead. So here he's bringing that replacement theology in. And if we go to the Dearborn Independent, in the Dearborn Independent, it says, and this is the Dearborn Independent for September 17th, 1921. The great bulk of the Jews were still gathered in Jerusalem as heretofore, and there were on the one hand intellectuals, and on the other the parasitic or pauperized Jew, and what would ordinarily be regarded as the very best and the very worst. In Jerusalem, one found the extremes of intensely narrow and bitter orthodoxy, and unbelief with extreme Bolshevik radicalism. Here too, aggressive Zionism manifested itself in an attitude of bumptiousness and aggressiveness. The country was for the Jew. It belonged to him, and he should shortly take possession. One was made to feel that one's presence in the land was objected to. And so again, they're saying, well, we're Christian. They don't believe in Christ. They're in the land in unbelief. Doesn't apply. That's kind of the idea that I'm getting there. Very, very similar. The Dearborn Independent accuses that Jewish journalists are a large and powerful group here. Large numbers of department stores are held by Jewish firms, says the Jewish Encyclopedia, and many, if not most of them, are run under Gentile names. Jews are the largest and most numerous landlords of residence property in the country. They are supreme in the theatrical world. And so Rutherford's mirroring the same idea in his book Vindication in the chapter on enemies. And he says, Rutherford says, big business has gained control of big preachers, big lawyers, big doctors, big engineers, and all of the various machinery of governments, all of which are resisting and opposing Earth's rightful king, Jesus.
So you got to look at the Dearborn Independent, Rutherford's books, everything going out there, the newspapers, as what Facebook is today. And just something goes viral. This was what was going viral back then, these ideas. They're forgotten because, like everything else, the customs, the traditions from years past are gone. But this was the viral context in the air going on right then.
It was the zeitgeist of the time,
Yep.
as was stated earlier. Rutherford's book Vindication again says, among the most powerful men who control the commerce of the sea are many Jews, so called, who are yet against God and against Christ and against the kingdom of God. The World War was really a contest for the control of the commerce of the earth, to control the great commerce of the seas of the earth. Rutherford's blaming the Jews for the World War. Ford, in the Dearborn Independent, it says, we know this. The Jews in their Congress at Basel in 1903 foresaw the World War. How do they know it was going to be a World War? Again, very, very similar.
When you think about this in perspective, a lot of the Jehovah's Witnesses are really living in the past. They've never gotten out of the zeitgeist of that time frame, that period. They're still today reliving the paranoid, and the religion is the same ideas of what was back from 1920ish and prior. They're still there.
That's interesting that you should say that, because it seems like the religion is based off of a lot of these ideas and that paranoia. They're out to get us, blaming everyone else. They're attacking us. They're accusing us. It's Satan, 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 Satan. It's a paranoia. The whole religion is based out of we're the chosen ones and they're going to come after us. And it's all based out of everything that they saw fulfilling at that time. But everything's involved in those 1920s
They never
conventions. Right? Yeah.
They never got out of that thought mindset.
They're still in it.
The word.
Yeah.
They never got out of the mindset of what Rutherford put in them. It's like going back, it's like going to a farm and it's an Amish farm. You don't see the heavy machine. They're all doing it, but they're stuck in the past. That's probably about the best example I could think of to compare.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very interesting. I hadn't considered it that way. I really appreciate that. So remember that Rutherford, the Watchtower and Rutherford and the Golden Age and the Enterprise, they didn't like that interchurch movement. The Dearborn Independent didn't like it either. So you could see the efficiency and cooperation brought to the church there in the May 1st, 1920 Dearborn Independent. And if you look up the history of that movement, it failed. It didn't quite work, but I had to see where did that go. I thought it was interesting.
And with that said, Jeff, that's why as we've discussed in the past, you wonder why this movement didn't fail. You see all the other ones that just fell apart. Something just kept this one going. That in reality, when all the prophecies failed, it should have been most people should have walked away. But I guess, like you said, you had ambitious people ready to create a new prophecy to keep the troops marching.
So there's a book called Faith and Economic Practice by Professor Paul Henry Heidelbrecht. And there's a statement here that I found interesting. It says, I do not think we can overestimate the importance of this movement. As I see it, it is capable of having a much far-reaching influence than the League of Nations. That would have caught Watchtower's ear, right? In bringing about peace, contentment, goodwill, and prosperity amongst the people of the earth. So executives from the Federal Council of Churches, including Barnes, who was active in the Chicago chapter, jumped on Rockefeller's bandwagon, determining to raise a generous portion. Remember, Rockefeller was an evangelical Christian, very, very rich man, and so he was involved in this. His dream cost him dearly, for the campaign fizzled in less than a year. Several denominations were suspicious of the scheme right from the start and willing to see their funds drained elsewhere. Some of the same denominations were experiencing internal tensions between fundamentalists and liberals. And from the conservative point of view, this was a liberal ecumenical extravaganza sponsored by Rockefeller, whose religious views were somewhat suspect. And so it didn't quite make it. But if you want to look more into that history, you can look at that. Always trying to fact check our history. So on Vindication, page 258, there's a statement. In contrast to this, during the World War, the Jews received recognition of the heathen nations. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration, sponsored by the heathen governments of Satan's organization, came forth, recognized the Jews, and bestowed upon them great favors. In this, the Seventh World Power took the lead. Now, big business and other wings of Satan's organization placed the Jews alongside of and in the same category as Gentiles. The Jews have received more attention at their hands than they really have deserved. So he's blaming the big business Jews for the Declaration, the League of Nations, the World War, and now the Dearborn Independent. August 1st, 1925, talks about this story and says, in the speech of Sheikh Suleiman Farouque, made in behalf of the Arabs to the colonial secretary a few days before, we do not ask Great Britain why she made the Balfour Declaration, but we do say it is oppressive. Great Britain gave the Balfour Declaration under certain economic influences. So in other words, they're blaming the business Jews for paying for the Declaration, for controlling the world. The Jews are in control of the League of Nations, right? That's what Rutherford's saying. And so Rutherford's linking the Jews in with this beastly world power. He went from seeing that the Jews were going to start a new, universal world here on the earth to they're part of this beast and satanic world power. Really quite a bizarre twist. But knowing what we know now from these ideas that are floating around in the 20s and 30s, it starts to make sense where he's getting that from. And we're going to look at his political influences as well to see some of that in his early history. Stay tuned. On page 268 of Vindication, Rutherford says, the fact that many Jews are now back in Palestine does not sanctify the name of Jehovah. On the other hand, God has brought forth his people and given them a new name and made them his witnesses. So we're the Jews, right? That's that replacement theology. The gathering of the Lord's true people began after the coming of Christ to his temple. Again, it's us. Because Israel's there in unbelief, so it can't apply to them at all. Except when you look at the context of the scriptures he's using here, the Jews are actually in unbelief. So if that was the Jehovah's Witnesses, then the Jehovah's Witnesses would be in unbelief. But regardless, the Dearborn Independent says something similar, and they take it a little bit further. When the British Army passed into Jerusalem in the memorable capture of the city in 1917, the protocols went with it. A symbolic circle was thus closed, though not in the way the protocolists had hoped. The man who carried the protocols knew what they signified, and they were carried not in triumph, but as the plans of the enemies of world liberty. Zionism is best advertised of all present Jewish activities and has exerted a greater influence upon world events than the average man realizes. It is impossible to verify this claim because it's only here in the Independent. We're going to look a little bit at the history of the protocols as well. Stay tuned for that. And so if we look at the history of what happened in the liberation of Jerusalem and those who walked through the gate, this was a General Allenby. General Allenby was not Jewish. General Allenby was Christian. General Allenby, it is reported that when he went to attack Beersheba, that he looked at the scriptures to see how it had been done in previous centuries and followed a similar attack to see how it would have worked. And he was able to capture Beersheba quite easily. When they went to liberate Jerusalem in 1917,
I was always interested what was going on. I was only 6 years old when I went downstairs and I saw people standing on either side of Yaffa Street. And I asked them, why are you standing here? And they said, Lord Allenby is coming down and we want to welcome him. And before long, I could see the horse coming down Jaffa Street. And everybody was so wild with excitement. We thought that Messiah was coming. This was our thought. Anyhow, he rode all the way and he went as far as the Jaffa gate is and dismounted and walked into the old city.
When they went to liberate Jerusalem in 1917, they leafleted the city, and the Arabs in the city picked up the pamphlets that said General Allenby is coming. Well, Allenby sounds like their language, the prophet of Allah. And so they thought the prophet of Allah was coming. So they laid down their guns without a single bullet being shot and surrendered the city. When General Allenby was going to enter the gate at Jerusalem, he dismounted the horse. It's reported that he said, only Jesus should ride on a horse through the gates into Jerusalem. And that's why we see the footage of him walking into Jerusalem when Jerusalem is liberated in that old silent footage. Knowing what we know about Henry Ford, let's compare what we know with Rutherford's Declaration of Facts to Hitler and the Nazi Party.